Welcome back. In this second video, I'll be showing you how to use the step-by-step lesson plan portion of the Core Knowledge Listening and Learning Curriculum strand for kindergarten through third grade. Now, the lesson plans are located in the anthology, which is essentially the teacher's guide for each domain. Now, if you haven't done so yet, be sure to watch video number 1 where I show you how to use the introduction section of the anthology, which contains information you'll need to teach the domain to your student. There's also important information in that video about how the listening and learning curriculum is structured, how this curriculum strand differs from the skills curriculum strand that makes up the other half of the Core Knowledge Language Arts curriculum as well. Now, before we start looking at those lesson plans, 3 quick reminders. First, you can download the free daily work plans and other support materials from my website, homeschoolworkplans.com. Second, this video is focused on the kindergarten through third grade language arts listening and learning curriculum, and specifically the first edition materials that are available to download for free from the Core Knowledge website. If you're looking for instructions for using grades 4 through 8, that language arts program for those grades, please check out my other videos on the Core Knowledge language arts curriculum for those grade levels, and you can find those on my website or on my YouTube channel. Now, specifically for this video, I'm going to be showing you how to work through a lesson with your student using the first domain anthology for second grade. However, all Core Knowledge Language Arts Listening and Learning domains for kindergarten through third grade are set up in basically the same way. So the information in this video is still going to apply even if you're using a different domain or a different grade level. All right, so let's get started on our detailed tour of an example lesson and this portion of the anthology. All right, so this domain or unit on fairy tales and tall tales is the first domain of 12 domains scheduled for second grade. Now, this domain has 8 lessons that are scheduled over 12 school days, as there's also a pausing point, a domain review, domain assessment, and culminating activities scheduled as well. And that sounds like a lot to keep track of, doesn't it? But the good news is you don't have to figure out what to do each day. I've already gone through all of these domains, and I've set up a daily schedule for the whole school year for you, and you can download that for free from my website. So with that schedule in hand, you'll always know exactly what to cover each day. All right, so for example, let's walk through lesson 5 for this domain, and let's start by taking a quick look at that free daily schedule I was telling you about. All right, so here we are on Monday of week 2, which is lesson 5 on Paul Bunyan. And you'll notice right off the bat that this lesson is divided into 2 parts, part A and part B. And you'll be completing both those parts of this lesson on a single school day. And a quick note, when you get to third grade, sometimes there's a third part listed as well, and then all 3 parts are completed on the same school day. Okay, so let's dive in and look at the introductory information for lesson 5 for this unit for second grade. Every listening and learning lesson starts out with a page just like this one. Right up front, you'll see the objectives for this lesson laid out, and these tend to be focused on literature concepts. Specifically for this lesson on Paul Bunyan, your student will be learning to identify tall tales as fiction, as well as work on identifying characters, plot, and setting, among a few other objectives. Then you'll see the broader language arts objectives listed down on the second half of the page. These tend to be more focused on reinforcing comprehension, grammar, or language mechanics concepts. So for this lesson, the objectives include students learning to identify and organize characteristics about the main characters in this tall tale, practicing asking questions to gather information, and a few other objectives. Now at the top of the next page, you'll see one more lesson objective, and that's the core vocabulary that will be learned during this lesson. Now remember back in video number 1, we looked at an overview page in the introduction section of this anthology that laid out all the core vocabulary for this domain. And we talked through the idea that the listening and learning curriculum is set up to introduce vocabulary in context, and that is to be learned through repeated exposure throughout the domain. Now, before we move on, though, a quick note. The 3 types of lesson objectives we just reviewed may seem overwhelming and a lot to read through and keep track of. But remember, this is simply an overview information. If you follow the step-by-step lesson instructions in the anthology that we're going to go through, you will achieve all of these objectives with your student. You don't have to carefully read through them and make sure that you do it. Now, on the second half of this page, this useful chart will give you an overview of the various parts of the day's lesson, as well as a list of materials and an estimate of the amount of time the lesson will take. Okay, a few quick notes here though. If you've downloaded the free organization and planning documents from my website, I've gone through every lesson in each domain and compiled supply lists so that you can have those handy before you even start a domain. Now, you will see at the top of this chart, it mentions using image cards, and we talked about that in the first video, but just as a quick reminder, those image cards are a separate PDF file that is located in the folder of domain files you downloaded from the Core Knowledge website. So it's the same folder where you find this anthology, the student flipbook files. If you go down to the bottom of the chart, you'll see it mentions needing Instructional Master 5B-2. Now, Instructional Master is just a fancy term for activity pages, and those are located in the back of the domain anthology. So in the back of this anthology, you have a whole bunch of those Instructional Masters. If you use the organization and planning documents from my website, you'll likely have already printed those, though, because it'll be on your checklist for the beginning of the unit to go ahead and print the Instructional Masters prior to starting the unit, so you have them handy. Now, in terms of the time estimates on this chart, I want to recommend taking these with a grain of salt. You'll see time estimates throughout the various subjects, curriculums in Core Knowledge. So keep in mind that time estimates are for classroom-based instruction. When we homeschool, we're providing something closer to intensive one-on-one tutoring. We're not really teaching a classroom full of kids, right? That's a very different thing. So typically, any component of any lesson in any subject is probably going to take less time if you're working with one child than with 30 kids. So for these second grade language arts lessons, the time listed for a full lesson, both parts A and B, are typically estimated to take around 70 to 90 minutes. So that is a block of a classroom teacher's day. Now, while it can vary from day to day, generally speaking, you can plan on spending somewhere between 50 and 75% that amount of time when you're working one-on-one with a student. And really, if you're an experienced homeschooler watching this video, you're probably laughing at me because you know that the amount of time to give any homeschooling lesson is going to be dependent on how much coffee you've had to drink and how motivated your child is for schoolwork that day. So your mileage may vary on any time estimate. So once you're ready to begin the lesson, you'll start right here on the first page of lesson for lesson 5A. Now, before we go any further, I wanted to quickly clarify that most regular listening and learning lessons for kindergarten through third grade have those two parts, right? So part A and part B. And then in third grade, you'll sometimes see a third part of the lesson focused on a writing project. But for the moment, for this example lesson, we're going to focus on the more common two-part lessons. And you'll complete both part A and part B on the same school day. But you should always complete part A first, and if at all possible, complete part A and part B at different times. All right, so I know that sounds confusing. Stay with me here. For example, I would suggest start scheduling the first part A lesson for early in the school day, and then the part B lesson for later in the school day. Separating these two lessons allows time for a student's brain to work on the part A material a bit and also allows them to be more fresh when reapproaching the material during the part B lesson. Little kids do better with shorter lessons, right? And not doing too many things in the same subject at once. All right, so let's start walking through this part A lesson. For every part A lesson, you'll need to have this part of the anthology open on your tablet or laptop, and then the student flipbook file will be open on your student's tablet or laptop. Okay, and just a clarification, that flipbook file is basically a electronic book of pictures, and you'll be reading from this anthology the story while they're looking at the pictures. Okay, so quick side note though, Core Knowledge is a scripted curriculum. So you're going to be guided step by step through presenting this material to your student. There is no guesswork needed here. It's going to tell you exactly what page you'll be reading or what page your student will be looking at and what you'll be reading. You won't ever have to guess where you're at. All right, so each part A lesson will start with guidance on how to introduce the lesson to your student. And in this case, lesson 5 is starting a new part of the domain where they'll be learning famous tall tales. And the background information and essential terms section will guide you through explaining some key vocabulary for these stories and showing them a US map and finding the purported location of the story. You'll also be previewing the read aloud by showing an image from the flipbook to your student and giving your student some guidance on specifically what to listen for as you read the story to them. All right, so then the next 4 pages of this lesson are step-by-step guidance for reading through this story with your student. You'll see bolded instruction to turn to a particular page in the student flipbook, and then you'll read the text here in the anthology while your student looks at the flipbook pictures. You'll continue to work through each page of the story using this method. And once you get the hang of it, this is actually really quite simple. You'll also notice there are notes on the left-hand column guiding you on specific things you can point out in the flipbook pictures to deepen your students' understanding as you work through the story. Once you reach the end of the story, the next page will walk you through comprehension questions you can ask your child to help them think through the various aspects of the story. And then the final page for this part A lesson will guide you through a word work activity. Now, these word work activities are short. They're typically 5 minutes where you specifically talk about one of the vocabulary words. For this lesson, the word is admiration, and the instructions will guide you step by step through engaging your student to discuss what the word means and how the word is used. Now, after you've completed this part A lesson, you'll move on to different subjects such as math, history, science, something like that. And then later in the day, you'll come back and work through the part B lesson. All right, so let's pretend you went and did a few other things, and now you've come back, and let's take a look at this part B lesson. Now, part B lessons are extensions of the part A portion and typically consist of 1 or 2 activities. These activities draw on information the student learned earlier in the day in the part A lesson. It's common for these Part B extension lessons to reinforce other language arts concepts or skills, such as comprehension, grammar, language mechanics, or composition. So for this example lesson, the first activity is to start filling out a chart where your student will learn to identify and organize characteristics of the main character in the story. So today's lesson was on the story of Paul Bunyan. The next few lessons in this domain cover the stories of Pecos Bill, John Henry, and Casey Jones. This is a really fun unit. I really enjoyed this one when I went through it 2 years ago. Now, this activity contains instructions for how to present this information to your student and guide them through the activity. So for the activity, you will be prompted to use an instructional master. Remember, those are essentially worksheets that are located in the back of the anthology. Let me go ahead and put that up here so you can see that chart. All right, and then next up, you'll work through a brief lesson to help improve your students' syntactic awareness, and specifically, you'll be working on regular and irregular plurals. Okay, so don't worry if you have no idea what syntactic awareness is. It's okay. Again, this lesson, as well as every core knowledge lesson and all of the subjects are laid out for you step by step, so you don't have to know what all these things are in advance. It's okay. Now, at the bottom of the second page, there is a note that there is an instructional master, again, an activity sheet, that contains a family letter to send home with the student. This is one of those things that's meant for a classroom teacher, and you can disregard it. All right, so the part B lesson's pretty short, right? That was it. That's the part B lesson for the day. Okay, so let's circle back and take a look again at a different school day on that daily schedule you can download from my website. So every listening and learning domain for kindergarten through 3rd grade contains at least one scheduled pausing point day. And for this first domain we've been looking at, the pausing point day is scheduled for Friday of week 1. All right, so let's take a look at the anthology to see how those pausing point days work. All right, for this domain, you will have only one day scheduled for the pausing point. For kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade, these typically occur in the middle of the domain. In 3rd grade, you'll see them often in the middle and at the end of the domain. Now, pausing point is a great time to review what the student has learned so far in the domain and take the time to reinforce that information with a variety of activities. The pausing point section of the anthology is going to walk you through the core content objectives learned so far and give you a number of options for activities for the school day, and you get to choose. So, for example, you could have your student do the performance task assessment, and if you chose that, the info for that is laid out right here in the pausing point section, or you can choose 1 or 2 of the other suggested activities. For some pausing points, suggested activities might be things like using a library book, which comes from the resources list in the introduction to the anthology. Or it could be something like inventing riddles or making a booklet of the stories they've learned so far, or even putting on a miniature play of one of the stories. Now, you'll want to look at these options for the pausing point at least a week in advance, so you can decide which activities you might be interested in doing. If you're using the organization and planning documents you can download from my website, any unusual materials or any suggestion to use a library book will be listed in the domain checklist, so you'll know about the options in advance and we'll have time to gather the items. All right, so let's pause for a moment. The activities suggested in the pausing point are fun. They're great ways to reinforce what your student has learned. However, if you get to a pausing point in a domain and you're running behind schedule on the core lessons for the domain, please use this day to catch up on the core lessons instead. These pausing point activities are always optional. It's much more important to complete all the core lessons in each domain before you move on. All right, jumping back to the daily schedule you can download from my website, you'll see right at the end of this first domain, a domain review is scheduled right there on Friday of week 2. Now, a quick note, you'll typically see domain reviews for kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, but not 3rd grade. For kindergarten through 2nd grade, listening and learning domains will typically have one day at the end of the domain scheduled for domain review. And this domain review day is very similar to the pausing point day we just discussed. The anthology will walk you through the core content objectives addressed in the domain, and you'll have your choice of activities to use for this day. The types of activities suggested are also really similar to those pausing point activities we just looked at. Now, as with the pausing point, I do recommend you review these options a week in advance so you can be aware of which options you might use. If you're using the organization and planning documents, you can download from my website. Any unusual materials or any suggestions to use a library book will be listed in that domain checklist, right? So you'll have a chance to get all of that together in advance. Also, just like the pausing points, the activities suggested are fun. They're great ways to reinforce what your student has learned. But if you get to a domain review day and you're running behind on core lessons, remember, core lessons are the priority. Get caught up on those first. All the activities of the domain review are absolutely optional. It's much more important to get those core lessons done. All right, jumping back to the daily schedule, we'll move on to week 3. And on Monday, you'll see the domain assessment is scheduled. Now, every listening and learning domain includes a day for domain assessment, and you can find all the detailed information for conducting the assessment in the domain anthology that we're looking at here. Now, I will say up front that any sort of assessment can be a hot topic among homeschooling parents. So some families feel very strongly they want their child to get that practice working through an assessment. Some parents feel strongly that they know where their child is at and assessments are unnecessary. And I have personally spent time in both camps. So I will tell you that I would really encourage you to give these core knowledge assessments a try. They're really well written. They're grade level friendly. You'll see here that the questions for the 2nd grade domain are straightforward. You can help your student read them, or you could even help them write their answer. Alternatively, you could do this entire assessment orally, so there's no writing needed at all. Now, every single question covers information specifically taught in the domain. And as a homeschooling mom, I found 2 big advantages to using these assessments with my kids. First, these assessments do give me another data point to better understand which pieces of information my child retained and which we may need to review a little more. Well, then we can use like the culminating activities for that, or some other type of review. Now, there are also going to be times when our students need to do some sort of assessment, right? So for example, I'm in North Carolina, and like many states, we're required by the state to give each student in our family a standardized test each year. And that test does not specifically cover fairy tales and tall tales. It'd be a lot more fun if it did. But I have found that once I started making these short assessments in the core knowledge curriculum part of our domains throughout the school year, my daughter, who's currently now in 4th grade, her test anxiety went way down. So that was really helpful because that 2-hour standardized test was something both she and I were dreading. And now instead she'd had some practice answering questions about information she read or learned, and that required annual test seemed a lot less scary. So giving these assessments, I think, can be very advantageous to you and your child. Also potentially important if you're planning on having them return to some sort of public or private school setting at some point. Getting this practice with assessments can be a really good thing. Now, having said all that, even if you opt to skip the assessments in the early grades, I would encourage you to start thinking about having your student complete them starting in 3rd grade. 3rd grade in the core knowledge curriculum is really a bit of a transition year. The listening and learning domain and the skills unit content start to line up, more like what your student will be seeing in 4th grade and up, where what they're learning in language arts kind of lines up with history, geography, and science. There's that coordination going on. So it's a good time in 3rd grade to start introducing some of these assessments and more formal things like that, which will make the transition to 4th grade a little bit easier. All right, now a quick note before you move on. You can find both the instructional master for the assessment, those are the assessment worksheets, and the answers to the domain assessment in the very back of the domain anthology. All right, one last time. Let's jump back to the daily schedule. We'll see here on week 3 on Tuesday, we have a day scheduled for culminating activities. And this again is something you'll see in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, but not in 3rd grade. Every kindergarten through 2nd grade listening and learning domain includes a final day for culminating activities. So similar to the pausing point in the domain review sections, you'll have a number of activities to choose from, and I'd recommend you take a look at them a week in advance, as well as review the organization and planning documents from my website for any notes about unusual materials or library books you may need to be using during those culminating activities. Now keep in mind that these culminating activities are coming right after the domain assessment. So if there was something discovered in the domain assessment that maybe your student was missing, maybe there was a concept or something they need some review on, you can use that information to choose which of these culminating activities to work through. Otherwise, they're just a lot of fun and they can be used for enrichment. All right, so that concludes our tour of the lesson plans portion of the Core Knowledge Language Arts Listening and Learning Strand Anthology. Okay, so a couple things. Remember, all of these anthologies for kindergarten through 3rd grade for these listening and learning units are laid out in basically the same way. So now that you've seen a lesson from one of them, you'll be in a really good position to work through any of these units. All right, be sure to download the organization and preparation documents from my website. They're free resources. I put in many, many hours of getting all this organization and scheduling work done for you, including that daily schedule, so you always know what you're going to be working on. I also have a lot more videos on my website and other things to download because I really want to put you in a strong position to give your child a high quality, affordable education at home. All right, so that's it for this video number 2. Best wishes on your homeschooling journey.